Welcome everybody to our Asian American History program today. So I think I'm assuming everybody knows, but we are the TJ Alumni Action Group, and we are a group of Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology alumni that are dedicated to educational equity at our alma mater, as well as in Virginia, and hopefully have some impact nationwide as well. And just wanted to share a little bit about the impetus for the event today. So we've noticed that at TJ, there are a number of cultural celebrations. You know, there were events hosted by various clubs or the PTSA for Lunar New Year or for Diwali, or various cultural events. But we noticed that there wasn't anything for Asian American History Month, and also that the events were all cultural celebrations, and none of them really talked about the historical context in which we find ourselves. So so we really wanted to just have an opportunity for us to reflect a little bit on Asian American history and how that impacts how we live and how we interact with one another, and how we do this work of diversity and inclusion in our midst. And so we're really pleased to have Dr. Archana Pathak with us. She is a scholar activist who is committed to visioning, creating, and sustaining a just, inclusive world. She frames her work around the stories that we tell and are told about identity and privilege. She's done diversity and social justice work for over 20 years. As a diasporic feminist, her integrated approach explores the ways in which we can be the change we wish to see in the world by fully exploring how systems of oppression function and building skills to disrupt and dismantle those systems. Using scholarly and community justice models, she explores the ways in which critical self-reflexivity begins and centers a journey of transformative social change. She serves on the faculty of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and is also affiliate faculty in the Department of Africana American Studies and the Media, Art, Text Interdisciplinary Doctoral Program at Virginia Commonwealth University. She also currently serves as a special assistant for programs and initiatives in VCU's Office of Institutional Equity, Effectiveness, and Success. So we're going to have Dr. Pathak give us an overview of some highlights of Asian American history that we can reflect on, and then we will have a panel discussion afterwards. Dr. Pathak.
Thank you. I'm just pulling up one more doc that I realized I wanted to share with you all. So first of all, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. I always hate hearing my bio. I was like, oh, too many words in there. I need to get rid of those words. They're so important when I wrote them, but then I hear it and I'm like, why do you say all those things? So thank you so much. And I'm happy to be here and speak with you all. I'm hoping that what we can really do is have a conversation around these ideas rather than me talk at you about any of this. And so the group asked me to come and talk about thinking about Asian American history and Asian America in the context of our current cultural and political moment here in the United States. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that based on my own work and my own scholarship. And so I need to preface this with that my work is really on the South Asian diaspora. And so most of my work looks at South Asian diaspora. However, the research that I've done and the theoretical analyses, the cultural analyses that I engage in are applicable to Asian populations in general. So there are definitely echoes of similarity that I think that others can hear and identify with. But I came to these conclusions, I came to these points of analysis through my own scholarly work with the South Asian diaspora. So I want to be clear about that. And so I want to talk a little bit about South Asianness. I'm going to talk about South Asianness first through a framework of race and understanding it from a racial perspective. Because in the United States, there's really no way to think about social identity without understanding it through the lens of race. Race is sort of the door we walk through in order to think about diversity in the United States, given our US historical context of chattel slavery. And so the notion of race, the social construct of race, and the politicalization of race are tied to how the United States makes sense of difference and how it makes sense of belongingness. So whether Asian American populations recognize themselves as a racial group or not, the reality is that they are racialized by others, if not themselves. And so that has to be the framework through which we understand this, right? And so first, even though I said that my work is with the South Asian diaspora, it's important to recognize that that diaspora is a complex and diverse population marked by class, caste, religion, region, nation, migratory generation, migrational cohorts, and migratory trajectories. And that's true, I think, across other Asian American populations, with the exception of caste being a particular South Asian Hindu phenomena. Though we know that caste gets located on non-Hindu South Asians as well. So we see some of that in the conversations with Sikh and Buddhist South Asians as well. But in many ways, all of these categories that I named are collapsed, erased, and misarticulated to shape the community's racial and ethnic trajectories in the United States. One such way in which we see these being threaded through the histories of South Asian communities, even through the ways in which they're collapsed, erased, or misarticulated, is the model minority narrative. This narrative is a highly racialized concept. South Asian Americans often utilize it to evade racial identification. And I would say that's true for other Asian populations as well. The idea of the model minority being a way to talk about how we are not a race, because race presumptively and linguistically in the United States is a conversation about Black and white. And so how do we take ourselves out of that conversation? We say we're a cultural group. And we'll see that move, and Rachel kind of alluded to that in the introduction, that the move towards cultural celebration is often utilized as a way of articulating model minority status, the idea that we are a good group of immigrants, we've learned to follow the rules, and we recognize that by following the rules that we can be successful in this country, though success is coded through whiteness, right? And so we see these things kind of play off of each other, right? And so, however, we also know that history has proven that we cannot evade racialization. No population can ultimately evade racialization. And it is a sad truth that that has proven itself true. For South Asians, it was 9/11. The demarcation of the other onto the South Asian body came through the horrendous violence of 9/11 in the United States, in which people were marked as terrorists. And then we saw, unfortunately, the same thing happen with the pandemic and other Asian bodies being marked as diseased and a disease-based threat through the ways in which we racialized the pandemic as well. And so while we understood the model minority narrative as this kind of space where one can gain financial success, and if you can make yourself financially successful, you can erase your racial self and just be this cultural group with all the positive connotations assigned to that. History has proven that the safety net of that is a false safety net. It's not actually a safety net at all. And any kind of sociopolitical phenomena can happen in which a group can become demonized. And that's proven true across Asian American communities as well, right? So we have to really think about what it means to talk about the complex categories of Asian Americans in the United States through this parameter of race. First, we have to understand that when we talk about any group in terms of how they are raised, first through legal categorization. And legal categorization is an interesting phenomena when it comes to race. It's always been in conflict when, for South Asians, were put between in the middle between Blacks and whites, and then Asian Americans are put outside of that. So there's this, it's a really interesting thing we see for South Asian populations, they're put in the middle, but other Asian American groups are put outside of. Both positions very tenuous and very problematic, because what we will see is that there will be a slippery slope when it comes to legal decisions around that. Right. And so two watershed moments in the US legal history around this is the two cases where two Asian individuals asked to be identified as white by law, and they approached the Supreme Court with that. So the first is the case, the US Supreme Court by Takao Ozawa, and then the second follow-up to that is by Bhagat Singh Thind. The Ozawa case is a Japanese individual who asks to be classified as white and is completely turned away by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says there is absolutely no way that Ozawa can be identified as white, right? And it's interesting because in the Ozawa case, there's this conflicted narrative of pride in one's cultural identity, but clear understanding that culture is not theirs. They are truly American, right? And Ozawa is denied completely. And similarly to Ozawa, we see Thind, and Thind is a Punjabi Sikh man who asks to be named as white, who asks to be classified as white in the Supreme Court. Both Ozawa and Thind argue in a assimilationist approach. They justify their entry into the legal category of white by showing that Ozawa attempts to show that he has assimilated, that he, for all intents and purposes, he is white. Look at all the things that he has done that shows and reinforces his complete whiteness, except for the virtue of appearance. And the court says, but what we see matters, and so we can't walk away from that, right? So Thind takes notes and approaches the Supreme Court and doesn't make the same mistakes, doesn't try to argue assimilation, doesn't say at all that he is able to prove an ability to assimilate. He argues that he is white based on his Aryan origins and being an upper class or an upper caste Hindu, right? So he's trying to then show, and this becomes really important because what he brings over with him from what is at the time colonial India, right, is the issues around caste that are playing out in colonial India and the ways in which that caste is utilized and weaponized by the colonial Raj. And so bringing that over and saying that there is a way in which my own kind of elite status within my own nation aligns with the eliteness of whiteness, and this would be a good argument to allow me to classify as white. However, the Supreme Court utilizes a different measure of belonging. So instead of talking about the inability to assimilate, at this point, the Supreme Court relies on a common knowledge approach of people knowing that Thind wasn't white and thus could not be classified as white, right? And this is interesting because this attempt to classify themselves as white was done for relatively practical or pragmatic reasons. The idea of gaining access to land ownership and other economic systems that were only available to whites at the time, right? So we're talking about a court case that happens in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so this is, it makes sense in a certain kind of way, but what it does is it sets up for us now a clear formal articulation of differentiation from Blackness. And this becomes a really big issue. And this will be set the tone for the relationship, the race, the idea of where Asian Americans fit in the race matrix of the United States. And it is a reflection of the already existing dominance of whiteness, right? That positions itself up against Blackness, saying Blackness is that thing down there that we want to avoid, distance ourselves from, etc., right? And the Asian populations buy into that, and part of being a model minority then becomes the narrative of being able to say we are distant from that, right? And so this becomes a really complicated kind of conversation. So on one hand, there's this distancing from Blackness, and on the other hand, there's also this incredible attempt to fight the rampant and virulent discrimination happening against Asian populations at the very same time. So while we're seeing this kind of attempt to position themselves as white, we're also watching a strong anti-immigrant narrative develop within the United States that does locate Asian populations as a threat, right? So whether that is through the idea of Chinese migrant labor being diseased, or South Asian men, particularly being political dissidents. So this is tied to the British Raj, where a good portion of the South Asian immigrants who came in to the United States in the late 1800s were part of the Ghadar Party. And the Ghadar Party was a political party that was working for independence of India from the British Raj. And so the British Raj informed the US government that the US government was harboring seditionists because they were allowing these immigrants to be here, and these immigrants were funneling money into the revolution in India, into the independence movement in India. And so this then lays the framework, right? We have Chinese labor here in terms of building the railroads, and we see kind of a demonization of that labor force as diseased. That's part of the kind of presumptive quarantining of labor of Chinese migrant labor. We see the South Asian population being positioned as being a part of a seditionist movement, and all of this helps lay the groundwork for the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then expands pretty quickly into the Johnson-Reed Act, which bans immigration from Asia across the board. Right, so it was just these like quick little stepping stones that allowed for this to happen. And I know I'm moving quickly through some of this history, but I want us to see. I really want to like take some time to lay out the connections between these ideas, right? And so this act then allows for the U.S. to stop to first deport those of Asian descent from the United States. So it's a mass exodus. It also allows for the banning of further Asian migration into the United States. So it's a shutting down, right? And it does a third thing, which is very important, is that it establishes the precedent for the US government to have control over Asian migration into the United States in perpetuity. Right. And so this is the setting up of the idea that there will be quota systems, that there are only particular kinds of Asians who will be allowed in, and they will be allowed in small numbers. And this becomes important because when we see the next major wave of Asian immigration into the United States for South Asians, the post-1965 migration wave, which is actually true for other Asian populations as well, because the Civil Rights Act, which had on it a rider which repealed the Johnson-Reed Act. So it removed the ban, which is why then it became legal and possible for Asians to migrate to the US. So many people think, oh, Asians just started migrating at this time because it worked out. And that's actually not true. It was actually, there's a clear ban against Asian migration in the US until the Civil Rights Act was passed, on which there was a rider allowing for Asian migration again, which is why the numbers go up very quickly. But components of the Johnson-Reed Act remained intact, which was the establishment of quotas, the designation of those quotas by US government based on US political relationships, right? and the controlling of the populations migrating. And so then we begin to see the migration of Asians in a very particular kind of way. So we see particular class and caste Asians coming into the United States. And that's in terms of education. Again, this is about brain drain, right? So there's brain drain out of Asia as these populations leave their nascent independent nations, right? To come out, to come out of colonial systems that are these nascent nations don't actually have a lot of infrastructure to support highly educated folks in a sustainable or to scale kind of way, right? And so they're looking for a place to go. And so they're being wooed by the West, but the West is then wooing particular elites. And so it's getting a particular kind of Asian immigrant. And that becomes really important because we see that the United States government is controlling what Asian from where, who does what, in order to create then an idea of the Asian immigrant in a very specific sort of way. This becomes critical to how South Asians are framed in the US then. For South Asians, when the Johnson-Reed Act was repealed, the South Asians who were given visas, who were given access to the United States, were overwhelmingly upper class, upper caste, right, with terminal degrees in STEM fields. So now the idea, but all of this then, we're thinking, we're talking decades later, and we hear things like stereotypes like, oh, Asians are good at math. Oh, if you're born into an Indian family, you have to be an engineer or a doctor, or but part of that is because that's who came, right? It's not like it was a society of only those people, but that's who came. And we know that others who did come and were able to get in who were not of that population. For example, the Dalit population, it's not that as though there were no Dalits coming into the United States, they were. But once here, they tended to identify racially as Black, which located them as separate from their own community, partly because they were already experiencing the same caste oppression in the diaspora in the US that they had experienced back home. And so they found more political sort of allyship in Black communities and Black spaces. And so we know that there are Dalits who connect there as well. So it's a complex and complicated history. I feel like I've already talked too long. And so the things that I want us to really think about as we get into this, right, is that as brown people or as people of color who are not Black and who are not white, we're often twisted into being both victim and complicit in the violence and power of how race works in the United States. And that is a very tenuous and difficult space to navigate. But it also has in it the echoes of our own colonial histories, in which particular populations, particular elite populations within our own home countries were utilized to control the masses. And so that same kind of colonial divide and conquer model gets reinforced through the race matrix in the United States. And so we see that then begin to play out. And so it becomes important to recognize that when we talk about the dominant structures within the US, they're tied to colonial histories, they are tied to our own history of chattel slavery, and they are tied to the absolute assumption and premise that incoming immigrant populations will not explore, examine, or understand the longer historical trajectories of their presence within the United States. Right? Lisa Lowe talks about this in terms of how Asian Americans are often referred to as perpetually, what she calls perpetually foreign. The idea that we're seen as always new immigrants, when in actuality, most Asian populations in the United States are third, fourth, fifth generation, right? We know that there have been Asian Americans from various countries in Asia and in South Asia who have been in the United States since the 1800s. And so that's not, that idea of perpetual foreignness is coded onto us, not just so we can be discriminated against as the immigrant, but also so that we keep we keep understanding our relationship to this nation in ahistorical ways, right? So that we as a population, one, don't look at our own history about what it's been like for us as a population to be here. Two, who got let in and who didn't, and how did the politics of this country in terms of race shape which members of our communities were even allowed to immigrate. And three, assuming that we would not engage in conversations with other communities of color because we were considered distinct from those other communities of color, right? And so the idea that we would not position ourselves as a color had a lot to do with making sure that we didn't build solidarity across varying racial groups in the United States, particularly in terms of African American and people of African descent. I think I'm gonna pause here because I feel like I could say a lot more, but it's probably better for me to pause and to have a conversation. Is that okay, Rachel? You're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Pathek, for that overview. It's really great to hear that context because I think so little of Asian American history is taught in our schools that when we pick up through our reading or whatnot, it's very fragmented, so it's good to have kind of a broad picture. So today we have two TJ alumni that we've invited to be part of this panel discussion. The first is Prachenda Bao. She is part of the class of 98 of TJ. And she was born in Cambodia at the end of the Khmer Rouge regime and came to the US with her parents as refugees. Currently, she lives, writes, and raises her 3 children in New York City. She is an incoming poetry fellow with Kudaman, a national Asian American creative writing organization. So we'll have Prachenda be part of our panel and discussion. And the other, our other alumna that will be on the panel is Helen Lee. She is from the class of 2012, and she has been involved with various groups such as APIA Vote, Nakasek VA, now known as the Hamke Center, and For Us Not Amazon. And she has recently moved to Missouri and is a teen librarian. So thank you to both Chenda and Helen for being willing to be part of the panel. So I guess we can start by just, first of all, if either of you want to offer any thoughts after hearing Dr. Pathek's overview, and then we can start off as with the question of, when did you start thinking of yourself as Asian American? And are there any particularly formative events that have shaped your Asian American identity? And also, Dr. Pathek, feel free to also chip in during this portion as well.
Sure.
So, Chenda or Helen, would either of you like to start us off?
Sure. Hi. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here. I loved, it was very interesting to listen to Dr. Pathak talk about the history, because it's definitely, in a lot of ways, it is like sort of new to me. And what you were saying about the perpetual foreigner and Asian American communities sort of approaching our position in the United States ahistorically, like, really resonates with me, because you would think that, coming from my background, like, the whole reason that my family is in the United States is because of really, like, the American involvement in Vietnam and in Cambodia. which triggered, so much instability there. But the truth is, like, when I was growing up, I never thought about American history or the American, I mean, that's just not something that ever came up in conversation, really. Certainly, the people in my family were dealing with the trauma of what they went through, but it wasn't. I'm not really sure if it was just like my particular family. I mean, it probably was just really my particular family, but we just, I was really sort of raised on this idea that like America is this benefactor, and we're really grateful to be here. Like, we escaped this really appalling situation in Cambodia and survived, and so it was just like this always being grateful to be here, and like America is the best country because in a lot of ways we're our savior. And it wasn't until I was really an adult, really like just very, very recently, that I really examined how my family got to be here. And I think it seems like that's a common experience for immigrant families coming here, especially if they're coming from places that are less stable than the United States. Like, just being told to be grateful, and being and having to prove ourselves, really, and prove that, like, we deserve to be here, we deserve all the things that and to take advantage of all the benefits of being in the United States. And I think that also contributes to the way that Asian Americans, but also I kind of think all Americans really view ourselves ahistorically. I don't think that most Americans really know American history, even though it's taught. It's partly sort of the way it's taught, but so it's really interesting now, I think, to see that there's like it seems like, I mean, it's more prominent, at least, or at least I'm noticing it, of these movements to like have culturally responsive curriculums. And now places are wanting to have these like sort of specific histories being taught in the classrooms. And I'm curious to see where that'll take us, to see sort of what the next generation, how they will think of themselves. In my head, it does seem like people are willing to talk to their children about things that they didn't used to talk about before. I mean, at least, my parents never talked to me about politics or history or any of those kinds of things. But these are subjects that for me, I feel are very important to talk about with my children, and to talk about with young people. And and I see the teachers at my children's schools like being more willing to approach these subjects that I think about when I was a child. Like, I don't think that an adult would ever want to put anything in context for me. And there's just seems to be this realization that children still live in this world and like see what's going on, and like whether or not we talk about it, like they still pick up on it. And so I know I, as an adult and as a parent, like feel a responsibility to put things in context for young people, because I don't know, it just seems like a shame to like not know your own history really until you're an adult, because it was always there. But yeah, I'm curious to hear what Helen would have to say.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, this is not working for some meetings. My name is Helen. Pronouns are she, her. I think I forgot the questions, but before I forget, I just wanted to like congratulate any of the kids watching for getting through the school year, because it was really rough, and all the teachers for getting through the school year, anyone who graduated, because it's been a very hard last 2 to 3 years. Like school is already, like graduating is already a really big deal, but like this is really difficult, and like anyone who made it through like should seriously like congratulate themselves for getting through it. And even like people who didn't, like it's gonna be okay, like we'll try to make it through. And all the teachers who made it through the school year, because also it's very, very tough. And all the teachers who are retiring, including Robert Rigby, who is like FCPS pride and like a total icon, I think, in terms of Fairfax County School Board. So definitely something I want to bring up since it's the end of the year, to say good job for getting through the school year. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I said it. And then thanks everyone for organizing this, and it's good to see everyone again. Yeah.
So Helen, just reactions to the history that Dr. Pathak laid out, or if you want to talk a little bit about when did you start thinking of yourself as Asian American, and whether there are particularly formative events that have shaped your Asian American identity.
Yeah, I think it's like very weird and complicated, especially like nowadays for people going to TJ, because even when I was there, it was like a plurality of Asians, South Asian, East Asian students. And so we never really, there's like a joke that some people talk about in terms of like enclave Asians versus non-enclave Asians. And like some people talk about it as like California and New York Asians versus everyone else, where like people who grew up around a lot of people who are Asian are like very chill and confident in their identity and don't really have to think about it. And like by the time I was at TJ, that was like kind of the environment we grew up in, where everyone was very comfortable with these things. So definitely like around college when there were a lot less of us. And actually the funny thing is that the thing that I miss was like a lot of the cultural shows, cultural events, because those were just like really casual and fun, but people didn't really seem to care about it at William and Mary. Although there's still people who seem to care about it, but it wasn't as like dominant where like everyone got involved in it. And I really missed it. So yeah, good memories. I think the thing that I like always kind of bounce back and forth with though is like the structure of race versus class in terms of US history. And I think that's like the age-old thing, and I go back and forth between it. And right now I think I'm leaning towards class. So we can talk about more of that with the other questions.
Dr. Pathak, do you want to make any comments about your formation of your Asian American identity?
Sure. I think that I've always been ambivalent about identifying as Asian American, partly because as a South Asian, we haven't been a part of Asia. So it's a double hyphen in many ways. So Asia, when we talk about Asia and Asian Americanness, it has always overwhelmingly been mainland Asia and Southeast Asia. That's how the US understands Asianness. And so South Asia has always been a different sort of space. It's often been named through its religiosity. And that's been a part, that's really informed my kind of understanding. And then the idea of South Asia itself is a pushback against sort of nationalist, post-colonial nationalist narratives happening within the communities about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and those ties to then religious identity as well. So I've always been pretty ambivalent in terms of that. But I will say that, I kind of came to my own understanding around race and the politics of difference in the United States through Black feminist writers. I came to the United States in the early 1970s. People weren't talking about Asianness, but they were still talking about being Black or white. And there was a clear, vibrant discourse around that. And so I really started thinking about my own identity as a non-white person through the writings of Black feminist writers. And so, but in doing that, also recognizing that I didn't identify as Black or Black. I didn't fit into that category either. So what did that then mean? Even though the idea of Black consciousness in a global way did include me. So there were a lot of layers there. And so I was able to, I think that had a lot to do with how I thought about it. I wanted to comment, Helen, on your question about class and race. And I think that this is the thing. We cannot divide class and race in this country. It isn't, is it class or is it race? It is class and race. Class and race were put together historically. In particular moments, we see very specific turns that happen in the US sociopolitical framework around understanding class so that it is a raced phenomenon. So that we can't pull those two apart, and the attempt to pull them apart is part of the problem, right? So the Bacon's Rebellion happened, and in that it was really about, it was a class movement. It was people who were not landed gentry, who didn't have the right to own land, who were not, indentured servants, and who were indentured servants, who were enslaved, who were domestic labor, indigenous populations, et cetera, who all got together and said, wait a minute, why, if this is an America that's going to be for everyone, why isn't it equal? And the landed gentry population went to those who were indentured servants, who had come over from Europe, and talked about how their whiteness set them apart, even if they didn't have the class ranking, right? The fact that they were European meant something, and it created a divide. And so at this moment, class and race become one. And so that turn actually collapsed that particular movement in this country. This attempt to say, let's have a class revolution here in the United States. Well, the response by the dominant class at that time was to racialize it, which created the divide, and then led to this kind of outbreak. And then from then on, we see sort of a race class connection throughout history. And then that gets mirrored again when we see which Asians are allowed in post-1965. They all tended to be upper class in their own nations. And remember, class isn't just how much money you make. It's about your rank status socially, right? So think about like the English peerage system. The peers aren't very wealthy anymore, but they still hold the class ranking of the nation, right? And so it's things like level of education, jobs and careers that you held in your home nation, the ways in which you were positioned in terms of the social structures and basically the social structures of the society, of your home society. All of that travels, right? So my parents were clearly upper class, and even though when they came to this country they didn't make any money because they were immigrants and they had to work low level education, wage labor kind of work, right? Which wasn't of their ilk. They did it, right? But their ability to go from that to their class level within a decade isn't because they're better at moving up in class. It's because all they did was get to the class they were already at. So, and class reads class. So you can go anywhere in the world and class will read class. So for example, urban elites in the United States have more in common with urban elites in other major global metropolises, whether they realize it or not, right? And we are distanced from our working class roots across the board. So I think the conversation that oftentimes we have, because we conflate migratory discrimination or migration trauma with classes, like class success, but the class came with us. We just reached the economic level of it after a few years. Does that make sense? So
yeah, but I think that like might apply more to like quote unquote legal immigration more, because there are a lot of like, you know, people who are coming who are in the US, undocumented migrants who definitely are not upper class, who are still Asian. And like,
I think I think that the documentation, it becomes part of that as well, but we know that that's still racialized. So we have undocumented European immigrants, right? But one of the largest populations of undocumented populations, one of the largest undocumented populations in the United States are Irish, right? And Canadians. But they're still able to get to that class thing. And so that's, again, it becomes a component of race, right? So I agree. I think that which undocumented populations are not allowed class ascendancy is also racialized.
But what do we do when we start talking about, like, you know, these really upper middle class Asian American people compared to, like, you know, I like, one of my neighbors is like a farmer from Oklahoma who's white. Like it gets really weird when we start doing that, and like doing, like, I think it's kind of weird to do like the matrix and to like have all these points and to map it all out. So yeah, I think in terms of that stuff, it's good to focus on like what like the material reality is. Like, what is your ability to like buy groceries? What is your ability to use using the restroom in a public space is like a material thing. And to ground it a little bit, because I think a lot of times, especially as things get more and more in like these professional spaces, a lot of conversations around race start getting really into like feelings, and that kind of like separates things out a little bit. So I think it's good to ground it. And I think especially for like kids who go to TJ, they're going to be in these spaces where a lot of the conversations about race might be more about feelings than about like, hey, there are like actual realities that a lot of groups and a lot of people face because of whatever reason.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think I do agree that we have to talk about material realities. I just think that the material realities of racial violence in this country there are material realities to that. And we're going to see that, we see that across class lines. So for example, after 9/11, it didn't matter if you made money as a South Asian, you were still facing the material reality of a particular kind of state and interpersonal violence. I think COVID showed us that people of Asian American descent faced material violence from the state and from interpersonally. So now, does that mean that people of working class ranks don't face problems? I don't mean that. I don't mean that those material realities are irrelevant. I'm simply saying that the material realities are more complicated, even if we would like them to be not so, right?
I'm going to push back on that again, because I mean, I think like even with the COVID example, right? Because a lot of people are talking about like, there's like a really huge conversation around like Stop API Hate and stuff like that, where it's talking about like vigilante violence against people who are Asian. That's like a lot of the framework about it, but there's a huge difference between someone who can work at home for like 5 days a week versus someone who is like front-facing worker. That's like a huge class difference even among Asians. If you don't have to like take the subway to get to work and then stand in front of a clerk desk or stand in front of a desk for like over 8 hours a day, because a lot of these people have to work multiple jobs at this point. Like you can't, I think like there's a lot of, I get really annoyed when I feel like, I think that a lot of that is getting flattened together to say that it's like a race thing, when also like there's a big, like even with like the Atlanta shootings, right? These are people who are doing close contact body work during a pandemic. That's like a huge experience that like if you're an office worker and you're working remotely, that like we can't really compare these two experiences, even if there is like a baseline of race between groups. And I think that like a lot of front-facing workers in general like experience the pandemic very differently. So I just think like that would be my pushback, is that there's a big difference there, even with it like us like from people of the same racial background, like depending on what they're doing for a living.
I think we're
So-
actually saying the same thing here, which is that we can't collapse it to just race or just class, that they have to intersect and that the two are inextricably intertwined in our society. And so I absolutely agree with you. I think that the experiences of working class Asian America are structurally more violent than the working class experiences of, or the experiences of upper class Asian Americans. That I have no argument with that. That's absolutely true, right? The thing is that Asian Americans aren't seen as having multiple class identities, right? The only kinds of Asian Americans that are like that, we don't even talk about class. We don't look at the different diversity of Asian America at all. And that comes from white dominant culture, right? So the idea that let's talk about it, like where the root that tells us to have these debates is the problem. And so my pushback is let's keep it the root and let's not hide the root, right? The root tells us that class ascendancy will fix the race problem. It won't. It absolutely won't. And our own colonial roots tell us that we aren't the same when we are of different classes. And that's also untrue when you bring that to the US context. It's also untrue back home, but it's definitely untrue in the US context. So I think we're actually saying the same thing, which is that we have to look at the diversity of our populations and understand the complexity of those, right? Part of the model minority myth is that Asian Americans are all upper class, and that's untrue. That's just plainly untrue. So
Yeah.
go
Oh,
ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, we've got a few minutes left, and this is a great time to talk about the different ways that people came to the US,
Yeah.
whether it's through a refugee experience or other or work visas or student visas. Maybe Chenda, you could start us off there. How has your family's experience of coming as refugees impacted your identity or how you think about being Asian American?
Thanks. I think this conversation has been really interesting. I think it really just shows that it really is important that we are looking at things like from a really a higher perspective, I guess, like a more expansive perspective, because it really is not you can't, I don't know, I sort of feel like you can't really drill down into either thing, because it's all so much of it is really a matter of relationships that you have with people and with communities, and the conversations that you're having within those communities in doing the work that you do. And I found it really interesting that Helen was talking about how like the different Asian American communities at TJ and maybe in college were differentiating themselves, like California versus New York versus elsewhere. And it was just really interesting to me because I'm just a lot older, I guess. And so when I was young, I don't, to be honest, and I feel much more akin with Dr. Pathak's experience of being ambivalent about the Asian American identity, because, and I'm not really sure if it's because of my parents being refugees, although, they never really, I don't know, I don't even know if they really had ever really used that word refugee, because it just kind of has this connotation of, I don't know, just, we grew up in Northern Virginia. They had a house, like, and they were very much strivers. And so they, I think, were really, worked really hard to like, not to give off this impression that that they were really successful and that they were just, like upwardly mobile. And I mean, kind of, buying into that, that they could, work their way into a different class or into a different position or something like that. but in terms of community, I guess, you know, we just hung out with the other refugee families. Like we were just with other, you know, with the family that managed to come over from Cambodia. And we were it was very much just like the weekends just with other Cambodian families. So, you know, more than anything, I think I would have identified as Cambodian rather than Asian American. And in college and in other, you know, when there were these groups that were sort of, you know, Asian American groups, like it just never occurred to me to like join those groups because there were just so few Cambodians. So like I don't know, I just never felt like that was something that was for me. And I feel like you know, maybe that's sort of similar with in other communities and other people coming from other countries and coming from the background, because I think that idea that like Asian Americans are like these upper class, highly educated, you know, model minority people is out there, and it's powerful, and it's bought by like a lot of people. And you know, because that is not my experience, you know, my family didn't, you know, I don't come from a family of doctors, and you know, I just never identified either with that with that with that path, that it just never, it was never really appealing to me as a young person to, you know, I never felt like really solidarity with those groups. And it for me, it really was when I was older, and honestly it was really like very recent, I mean really like since Trump was elected, where I started to really examine the ties that I have towards communities, because you know, one of the things that I really felt was missing was that there is just this this isolation, this distance from our history, from our roots, that really has allowed, you know, in my opinion, has allowed people to, you know, make a lot of assumptions about other people, make a lot of assumptions about different populations, and also it really impedes our ability to to make it better for everybody, you know, because we're all so like invested in particular narratives about other people, and for me it was really like sort of learning about like the history, Asian American history, the history of Asian American organizing, and the solidarity with you know, the working class solidarity that was being built in like the 60s and 70s that, you know, we weren't taught about in schools, that it's made me and you know, feel more determined, inspired to be involved in you know, things that are working towards, you know, solidifying those solidarities that were started you know, back in the day, and also to be to think about, you know, the different ways that we can all do that work. We can all build, you know, build those relationships, build that community that's been missing, and you know, the community that, you know, white supremacy does not want us to have. And so, you know, that's sort of where I've started to like sort of see myself, I suppose, in America, is sort of that realization that this white supremacist history and culture has been really suppressive, and but it doesn't have to be, but it is complicated, and it's hard to like admit, I think, it's hard. Those conversations are really difficult to have because it's so pervasive and it's really insidious, and you know, it really hides itself in a lot of different ways that we don't think about, and nobody ever likes to be nobody ever likes to think that they're a part of an oppressive culture.
Dr. Pathak, maybe you can offer a few closing words of encouragement for us as we leave this time. I want to honor everybody's time, but I did want to give you a chance to offer some closing words.
Well, I actually think that Helen and Chenda very eloquently articulated what solidarity is about for us as Asian Americans, and that is that we have to be willing to understand the diversity within our own communities and not fall into the dominant culture's articulation of us as a monolith. And that diversity is around migratory histories. It is around documentation and access to systems. It is around class. It is around generational differences of migration, as well as generational differences of racialization in the United States. And both Helen and Chenda did a really brilliant job at speaking to, we can't look at ourselves from the same lens that they tell us to look at ourselves from, right? So I think that for me, the point of hope is that we are having these conversations, that we are all coming to the table and being willing to push at each other and say, what is the most complex way in which we can understand our communities, so that nobody is left out of the conversation. So that in the process of celebrating our culture, we aren't actually then just recreating the supremacist culture and that violence again for ourselves, right? Edward Said, I've been using this quotation of his a lot lately, and that is that Edward Said said that diversity is a tool of empire, right? The goal isn't to celebrate diversity. The goal is to make sure we are accepted and empowered and have access, right? That's really what, when people talk about let's be diverse and celebrate our diversity, it's like celebrating diversity actually makes me a little squeamish, because attention isn't the same thing as access. And so I think that's what I would leave us with, that we work towards access instead of just attention.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Chenda and Helen for being part of this conversation and allowing all of us to hear your thoughts and reflections. Thank you everybody for calling on, and I hope that you all had an enjoyable experience, lots to think about. All right. Thank you all.